They called her Cursed in the village of Ashford, and when the mountain man came down for supplies, the elder made sure he knew it. The girl's name was Catherine, and she had been marked by misfortune so thoroughly that even the church could not wash it clean. Her mother had died bringing her into the world. Her father had lost his sight 3 years later. Her younger brother had taken ill with a fever that the doctor said should have killed him, and though he lived, something in him never quite healed after. The village knew these things. They knew them the way villages always know things, not through official record but through the quiet accumulation of whispered conversations, through the careful way people averted their eyes when she passed, through the doors that closed a little faster when she approached. When she walked to the market, the other young women would exchange glances. Not cruel glances exactly, but something more final than cruelty. It was the look of people who had made a decision without her knowledge and found no reason to change their minds. Catherine was 25 years old, and in a village where most girls were married by 18, this fact alone was damning. But it was not the worst of it. The worst of it was that she had begun to believe them. She had begun to accept the narrative that her very presence brought bad fortune, that to marry her would be to sentence a man to a life of diminishing returns, of crops that failed and livestock that sickened, of dreams that turned to ash before they could be realized. The elder, Thomas Blackwell, had made this belief official. He was an old man, ancient by the measure of the village, with white hair that stuck out from his head like dried grass and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had been born in the village and had served as elder for 43 years. When he spoke, people listened, not because his words were particularly wise, but because they had learned that resisting him was harder than accepting him. It was Thomas Blackwell who had first declared Catherine cursed, though even he seemed uncertain of the exact nature of her curse. It was simply there, he said, like a shadow that followed her. He suggested prayers. He suggested penance. He suggested that perhaps her family had offended God in some way that he, in his infinite justice, was punishing through her. None of these suggestions ever mentioned what the penance might be or how one could possibly atone for offenses unknown. The truth, Catherine knew, was simpler and far more terrible. She was cursed because she was useful to curse. She was cursed because it explained the inherent unfairness of a world that promised love and security to girls who did nothing to deserve it more than she had, yet somehow arrived without her. She was cursed because other people's suffering was easier to bear when it could be attributed to something outside themselves, something they could not have prevented. On a cold morning in November, when the first real snow had begun to fall, and the village had started making preparations for the long winter ahead, Catherine was at the market selling the embroidered linens that were her primary means of support. Her needlework was exceptional. Even those who avoided her could not deny it. The detail was fine, the patterns intricate, the colors vivid and carefully chosen. But the prices she received for them were always lower than what the work deserved, and people often haggled even when she had already reduced her asking price below what was reasonable. A woman named Margaret came to her stall that morning. Margaret was the wife of a merchant, a position that gave her a certain authority in the village hierarchy. She picked up a handkerchief that Catherine had embroidered with forget-me-nots, tiny blue flowers that seemed almost to move across the white linen. The work was meticulous. Margaret examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands, looking at the back where the stitches were even and precise. "How much?" she asked, though the price was clearly marked on a small card beside it. "2 shillings." Margaret made a small sound, something between a sigh and a laugh. "That seems rather dear, don't you think?" Catherine knew what was happening. She had learned this script, for work that would cost 4 shillings from anyone else. She said nothing, simply waited. Margaret set the handkerchief down on the table. "You know," Margaret continued, "my sister-in-law was thinking of commissioning something, but I told her I wasn't sure it would be wise, given your situation." Catherine's hands were folded in her lap. She kept them there. "What situation?" she asked, though she knew the answer. Well, Margaret said, looking around as if the village itself would back up her next words, everyone knows about your family, about the things that happen. I wouldn't want her to commission work and then have something unfortunate occur. It would be just like you to bring trouble to a gift that was meant to be a blessing. Catherine had heard variations of this before. The curse worked in mysterious ways, people said. It could attach itself to objects, to money, to any gift given or received in association with her. It was remarkable. She had sometimes thought with a grim sort of dark humor how efficient her curse was. It could simultaneously explain her own poverty and justify why no one else risked engaging with her. It worked in their favor so perfectly that she sometimes wondered if they had invented it themselves, if it existed nowhere but in the space between their fears and their judgment. 1 shilling 6pence, Catherine said, for the handkerchief. Margaret smiled, a thin expression that barely reached her eyes. I think I'll have my sister-in-law ask someone else. There's a girl in the village 2 towns over who does nice work. No curses that we know of. She set the handkerchief down again and walked away. Catherine picked it up and folded it carefully. The snow continued to fall, covering the market in white. The stall beside hers, occupied by the butcher's wife selling preserved fruits, was doing steady business. The stall on her other side, where a girl named Susan sold bread, was surrounded by customers. Catherine had 3 customers all morning, and none of them bought anything. By noon, she had packed up her goods and begun the walk back to her cottage. The cottage was small, set apart from the rest of the village at the end of a narrow lane that was more path than road. It had belonged to her mother's family, and she had inherited it along with the debts that came with maintaining it. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney drew poorly. The windows rattled when the wind came up. But it was hers, or nearly hers, and she had made peace with its flaws the way she had made peace with her own. Inside, she built up the fire and sat at her small wooden table with her embroidery. She had several commissions in progress, though she had not received a commission in nearly 3 months. She simply continued working because the alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like surrender. The needles clicked in the quiet afternoon. Outside, the snow fell deeper. By evening, the world beyond her window had become a landscape of white, undifferentiated and clean. The next morning, Catherine woke to a sound that seemed wrong in some essential way. It took her several moments to understand what she was hearing. A horse, somewhere outside, moving along the path that led to her cottage. Visitors rarely came to her cottage. The path was difficult to find, and most of the village had learned long ago that calling on her was a social liability. Catherine rose and dressed quickly, aware that she was being observed. Through the small window, she could see a man on horseback, his face hidden by the hood of a heavy coat. He was large, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to space and solitude. He dismounted, and she watched as he secured his horse to the post beside her cottage. Then he approached the door. Catherine opened it before he could knock. She found herself looking at a man perhaps 5 or 6 years older than she was, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that were a curious shade of gray, like stones pulled from a stream. His face was weathered, marked by years of living in conditions that did not spare people their harshness. He was not dressed like anyone from the village. His clothes were practical and worn, made for function rather than appearance, and they bore the marks of someone who worked hard and did not concern himself with impressing others. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He was studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he were trying to read something written on her skin. Finally, he spoke. "Are you Catherine?" Not a question, but a statement. "Yes," she said. "My name is Thomas Ward. I'm from the mountain settlements to the north. I came to the village yesterday for supplies and spoke with the elder." Catherine felt something in her chest tighten. Thomas Blackwell had spoken of her to this stranger. That could mean nothing good. "What did he tell you?" she asked, and heard the steadiness in her own voice and was grateful for it. "He told me you were cursed, that misfortune followed you, that no good man would take you as wife. that your very presence was a vector for bad luck. Thomas Ward stepped slightly to the side, and Catherine realized he was looking past her into the cottage, taking in its details. He seemed to be cataloging everything: the simple furniture, the fire burning in the fireplace, the needlework scattered across the table. His eyes lingered on the embroidery. "Did he tell you anything true?" he asked. Catherine did not answer immediately. She was trying to understand why he was here, what his purpose could be. The mountain man, the stranger, the one who had listened to the elders' warnings and had apparently decided that Catherine was worth meeting despite them. Or perhaps because of them. There was a particular kind of man who was drawn to broken things, who saw damage in others as an invitation to fix it, as if his love or care could remake someone into something better. She had learned to fear these men. They wanted a project, not a person. They wanted to be heroes in a story that was not theirs to write. "I've had bad luck in my life," Catherine said carefully. "I've experienced loss. Loss is not a curse. It's just being alive." Thomas Ward nodded slightly. "The elder also mentioned your father, that he went blind, that this happened after you were born." "Yes." "And your brother, that he took a fever." "Yes." "And your mother, that she died bringing you into the world." "Yes." Thomas Ward's expression did not change. He continued to watch her with those gray eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Those are sad things," he said, "but they are not curses. They are griefs. They are the cost of living long enough to love people." The matter-of-fact way he said this, as if grief and loss were simply the price of existence, something to be paid without complaint or question, shifted something in Catherine. For so long, she had been carrying her family's sorrows as if they were evidence of her own wickedness, as if her very existence had somehow caused all of it. But the way he named them, simply and without drama, made them seem less like curses and more like the mundane tragedies that befell everyone, the things that people endured and moved forward from because there was nothing else to be done. "I have land to the north," Thomas Ward continued. "Good land, productive land. I have a house that I built myself, which means it is imperfect but sturdy. I have livestock and tools and space. What I don't have is a wife. What I don't have is someone to share the work and the living of it." The way he said this was direct and without sentiment. He was not offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her work and partnership, and a place in his life that had nothing to do with curses or bad luck. "Catherine," he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me truthfully. Not with what you think I want to hear. Not with what the village has taught you to believe, but with the truth as you understand it. Do you believe yourself to be cursed?" Catherine considered this. She thought about all the whispered conversations, all the closed doors, all the reduced prices and careful distances. She thought about the weight of being marked as something other, something dangerous. She thought about how she had come to accept her own condemnation so thoroughly that she barely questioned it anymore. "No," she said finally, "I don't believe it. I never really did. I just stopped fighting against it because fighting was exhausting and the village was stronger than me." Thomas Ward reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of coins. He set it on the table just inside her cottage. "This is to cover your debts and your preparations. We leave in 3 days. I'll return at dawn on the 4th day. You can bring whatever you want, but we travel light. I have everything we need at the house." 3 days is not a long time," Catherine said. "It's long enough to decide. And if I decide not to come—" He looked at her directly then, and she saw something in his face that she had not seen in the faces of men in the village. She saw the possibility of her refusal being acceptable to him. He would not think less of her. He would not judge her. He would simply ride back to his mountains and his life, and she would remain in the village. But he would not make her choice for her. "It has to be your decision," he said. "I won't take a woman who is running from her life. I want a woman who is running towards something." 3 days later, when Thomas Ward returned at dawn, Catherine was waiting for him with a small bag containing her few possessions, her mother's ring, and a collection of her finest embroidery. She had left a letter for the village. Not an explanation, but simply a statement that she was leaving of her own will, that she was not fleeing in shame or desperation, but in hope. The cottage she left to the church, with a note that they could do with it as they saw fit. She did not ask permission. She simply locked the door, left the key under the threshold stone, and climbed onto the horse behind Thomas Ward. They rode away as the village was waking, as smoke began to rise from chimneys, and people began the business of their ordinary days. No one came to say goodbye. No one called out warnings about the curse that was leaving their midst. They simply watched from windows, perhaps grateful to be rid of her, perhaps afraid, perhaps already beginning to revise the story of Catherine and her curse into something that fit better with the narrative of a village that had done nothing wrong. Thomas Ward did not speak much as they rode. He pointed out landmarks, the path they were taking, the way the land changed as they climbed higher. He showed her a clear spring where they stopped to water the horses. He explained how they would reach his house before dark, how they would rest the first night, and how the next day the real work would begin. Catherine listened and watched the landscape transform around her. The village fell away behind them, and with it, the weight of its judgment. The air was different here, colder and clearer. The sky seemed larger, as if it could contain more possibility than the narrow sky above the village. As the day progressed and they climbed higher, Catherine felt something in her beginning to shift. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it was there. It was the sensation of being released from a burden she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. When they arrived at Thomas Ward's house, it was just as he had described. It was imperfect but sturdy, built into the side of a hill, with two large windows that faced south and caught the afternoon light. The roof did not leak. The chimney drew perfectly. The space inside was open and clean and full of possibility. Thomas Ward showed her the bedroom that would be hers, a small room off the main living area. He showed her the kitchen, the storage for food and supplies, the workshop where he made and repaired tools. He showed her the land surrounding the house, the areas where he planted crops, the pasture where his livestock grazed. He explained what he needed from her, and it was straightforward. He needed someone to manage the household, to prepare food, to maintain the clothing and bedding. He needed someone to help with the animals when required and to keep track of supplies so that they could plan for winter. In return, she would have shelter, food, safety, and a share in whatever he built. It was not a love story. It was not the kind of marriage that people in villages dreamed about. But it was honest, and it was offered freely, and Catherine found that these things mattered far more than the romantic fantasies that had been held up to her as ideals. The first weeks were difficult. Catherine's body was not accustomed to the physical demands of rural life. She had spent her days in the village sitting with needlework, her hands skilled but her back and legs unused to labor. Her shoulders ached from carrying water. Her hands blistered from chopping wood. Her feet grew sore from walking the land, learning the routines, understanding the seasons and the animals and the rhythms of a household that operated by necessity rather than convention. But as her body adapted, something else began to happen. She began to thrive. Her hands grew strong. Her face, which had been pale from spending so much time indoors, took on color from the sun and wind. Her body, which had never fit the narrow ideal of beauty that the village valued, found that it was perfectly suited for the work she needed to do. The strength that had made her ugly in the village became an asset here. She could lift heavy things. She could work for hours without tiring. She could solve problems with her hands and her mind. Thomas Ward watched this transformation with something that might have been satisfaction. He did not comment on it. He simply began to trust her with more responsibility. He taught her about the land, about the plants that grew well here, about the animals and their needs, about how to read weather and seasons and the subtle signs that indicated what was coming. He taught her about building and repair, about maintaining tools, about planning for the future. In the evenings, when the work was done, he would sit by the fire and they would talk. Not the superficial conversations of the village, but real discussions about ideas and beliefs, and the shape of their lives. Catherine had not realized how hungry she was for this kind of conversation. In the village, women were not supposed to have thoughts about anything beyond household management and the bearing of children. Men were not supposed to be interested in what women thought. But Thomas Ward seemed genuinely curious about her mind, about the way she saw things, about her ideas and her observations. It was in one of these conversations, perhaps 2 months after she had arrived, that Catherine mentioned the letter. She had written it, she said, on the night before she left the village. She had wanted to explain to the elder why she was leaving, what she had come to understand about the curse and her place in the world. Thomas asked to read it. Catherine retrieved it from where she had kept it with her most precious things. Thomas read it by firelight, his face grave and concentrating. When he was finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "What you said in this," he told her, "about the curse being not a thing that was but a thing that was made. That people will accept what they are told about themselves until they decide to believe something different. That the curse only had power because you had given it power. These are true things. These are important things." Catherine felt warmth in her chest, the sensation of being truly seen and understood. Months passed. Spring came to the mountains, and Catherine helped Thomas plant crops in the fields around the house. She learned about seeds and soil and the particular growing seasons of different plants. She learned that she had a gift for knowing when things needed water, when they needed to be thinned, when they were ready to be harvested. Under her care, the vegetable gardens became more productive than they had been in the previous years when Thomas had managed them alone. The animals, too, seemed to respond to her presence. The goats began producing more milk. The hens laid more eggs. Thomas said this was because she took care in everything she did, and the animals could sense that. Catherine wondered if it was something else, if perhaps the animals could sense that she was no longer a victim of a curse, that she carried no shadow of doom that might transfer to them. Whatever the reason, everything she touched seemed to flourish. Word of this eventually reached the village. Merchants traveling through occasionally brought news from Ashford, and in one such conversation, someone mentioned that Catherine had married the mountain man, and that she seemed to be thriving in that place. When this news was reported back to Thomas Blackwell, the elder apparently made a statement that Catherine found both absurd and oddly validating. He declared that the curse had not been lifted, but rather that she had spread it to the mountain man. This explained, he said, why her life had improved so dramatically. She had simply transferred her curse to the man she had married, and now he would suffer the consequences of having taken her as wife. The very first test of this theory came that spring, when a late frost killed much of the early planting. Thomas had lost perhaps a quarter of what he had put in the ground, but the loss was manageable. He had been farming this land long enough to know that some years were harder than others, and he planned for these losses. He did not blame Catherine. He did not suggest that her presence had brought bad luck. He simply assessed the damage, decided what to plant again, and moved forward. Catherine overheard him talking to a merchant who passed through their land. The merchant asked if the loss was serious. Thomas said it was normal. "Farming is not a guaranteed thing," he said. "The land gives what it will give. We work to encourage it and we accept what comes. This is how it is." The merchant seemed skeptical that anyone could be so philosophical about losing a quarter of their crops, but Thomas simply shrugged and offered him a drink of water and a place to rest his horse. When the merchant left, Thomas went back to his work as if the conversation had never happened. That summer, the crops that had survived the frost grew abundantly. Thomas's livestock remained healthy. His horses did not sicken. His tools did not break. The house did not burn down. The mountains did not collapse. The curse that the elder had warned about, if it existed at all, was not making itself known. By the end of the first year, Catherine and Thomas had established a life that was productive and stable and genuinely pleasant. They had built something together. It was not romantic in the way that novels depicted romance, but it was real. It was based on work and respect, and the daily choice to continue building rather than abandon the project. On the anniversary of the day that Catherine had arrived, Thomas took her into the village. They went for supplies, but they also went to show Catherine's transformation to the people who had decided she was cursed. It was an unnecessary thing to do, perhaps even unkind, but Catherine understood his reasoning. He wanted the village to see that she had not been ruined by his marriage. He wanted them to understand that their judgment had been based on nothing real, that the curse they had identified had been constructed from fear and superstition, and the deep human need to explain suffering in ways that made the people doing the explaining feel less guilty. They stopped at the market, and Catherine greeted people she had known her entire life. She was not the same woman who had left. Her shoulders had broadened from labor. Her hands were strong and marked by work. Her face was tanned, her hair bright from sun. She did not dress like a village woman anymore. Her clothes were practical and well-made, but they were the clothes of a woman who worked with her hands and did not concern herself with fashion. Some of the village people barely recognized her. Others recognized her immediately, and what Catherine saw in their faces was the most complicated mixture of emotions. There was surprise, certainly. There was perhaps a touch of envy, which made Catherine smile inwardly, because the village woman whose life she had envied before leaving had looked at Catherine with a kind of desperation in her eyes, as if she were trapped in a life that did not fit her, and saw in Catherine a kind of freedom that she herself had surrendered. There was judgment, too. Some people seemed to look at Catherine with an expression that suggested they were waiting to see if she would fall, if the curse would assert itself in some way, if the mountain man would soon be struck down, and she would be forced to return to the village in shame and poverty. Thomas Blackwell the elder was in the village square when they arrived. He stood looking at Catherine with an expression that was difficult to read. For a long moment, neither he nor Catherine spoke. Then the elder said, "It seems the curse has followed you." Catherine considered this. She could have said many things. She could have told him that he was wrong, that there had never been a curse, that he had constructed one because it served his purposes. She could have told him that her transformation had nothing to do with any supernatural forces, and everything to do with a man who believed in her, with work that was meaningful, with a life that was built on honest foundations rather than fear and judgment. Instead, she simply said, "The curse followed me because I believed in it. When I stopped believing, it lost all power." The elder made a small noise, something between a laugh and a scoff. "You believe what you want to believe," he said. "But I know curses when I see them." Catherine smiled, and it was a kind smile, because she understood now that his belief in curses was not really about her. It was about his need to explain why life was hard, why some people suffered, why the world did not give everyone the same advantages. It was easier to believe in curses than to look honestly at the structures of power and judgment that he himself had created and perpetuated. They did not stay long in the village. Thomas purchased what supplies they needed, and they prepared to leave. Several people came to them as they were packing the supplies onto their horses. These were people Catherine had known, people who had whispered about her curse, but had also, perhaps, felt a certain discomfort with the role they had been assigned in the narrative of her damnation. They told her she looked well. They asked cautious questions about her life in the mountains. They did not apologize, because that would have required them to admit that they had been wrong, but they acknowledged in small ways that something had shifted. Catherine answered their questions kindly. She told them about the mountains, about the work, about the life she had built. She did not boast. She did not suggest that her life was better than theirs, though privately she knew that it was. She had work that was meaningful. She had a partner who respected her. She had space and air and freedom. She had a life that she had chosen rather than a life that had been assigned to her, because she was not pretty enough or young enough or lucky enough to be chosen any other way. As they rode out of the village, Catherine did not look back. Thomas rode beside her, and they climbed the path that led to the mountains, to the house he had built, to the life they had constructed together. The wind was cold and clean, and the sky was vast and empty of judgment. That winter was harder than the first winter had been. Thomas had warned her that winters in the mountains could be severe, and the one that came that year proved his point. The snow fell deeper than it had the previous year. The temperatures dropped so far that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The animals had to be brought into the barn and cared for constantly. The work of simply staying warm and alive became consuming. Catherine and Thomas worked side by side, chopping wood, maintaining the animals, preserving the food they had grown, maintaining the house. There was no time for anything but work, and Catherine found that she did not mind. She had learned something important, that the satisfaction of work was greater than the satisfaction of leisure. That the human body, when it was strong and capable, could endure things that seemed impossible. That there was a particular kind of peace that came from working in partnership with someone else toward a shared goal. One night when the storm was particularly severe, Thomas and Catherine sat by the fire, and Thomas told her about his life before she had come. He had been married once, he said. His wife's name had been Eleanor. She had loved the mountains as much as he did, but she was not strong enough for the life. She had contracted an illness in the second winter, and despite everything he had tried to do for her, she had not survived it. He had blamed himself. He had believed that his insistence on living in such a difficult place, his commitment to building this life in the mountains, had killed her. He had considered leaving, going to a town where life was easier, where there were doctors and other people and safety. But he had stayed, because leaving felt like abandoning her memory. And then he had gone to the village for supplies, and he had heard the story of Catherine and her curse, and something in him had recognized something in the story that was not what the village thought it was. He had recognized a person who was being condemned for things beyond her control, for the simple fact of existing in a way that did not fit the prescribed narrative. He had recognized someone who deserved a chance to be seen differently. Catherine was quiet for a long moment after he finished speaking. Then she asked, "Do you regret it, taking me as wife? Marrying someone from the village when you had tried that before? Do you fear that the pattern will repeat? That I too will sicken and die in these mountains?" Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I did fear that. When I first went to the village, that fear was part of what drove me. I thought perhaps if I could save someone else, it would balance the scales. It would absolve me of the guilt of not being able to save Eleanor. But that was not really why I chose you. I chose you because you were strong in a way that Eleanor was not. Not physically, though you are that, but strong in your spirit, strong in your refusal to accept the damnation that others were trying to place on you, strong enough to survive." Catherine felt tears on her cheeks, though she was not sure if she was crying or if they were simply the response of her body to the heat of the fire. She reached for Thomas's hand and held it. They sat in silence as the storm raged outside, as the house held them safe within its walls, as the fire burned steady and warm. Days and then weeks passed. Christmas came, and though they were far from any church or town that might be celebrating, they marked the day quietly by resting and sharing a meal that Catherine had prepared with care. Thomas gave her a gift that he had been working on in secret during the months before the winter set in. It was a loom, a beautiful thing made of wood he had seasoned carefully, capable of producing cloth. Thomas explained that he had noticed how Catherine's hands moved when she was thinking, how they seemed to want to work, how they clearly missed the intricate needlework that had been her means of support in the village. "I thought perhaps you might want to weave," he said. "It is different from embroidery, but it is also a way of making something beautiful from raw materials." Catherine was overwhelmed. She had not realized that he had been paying such close attention to her, that he had understood that a part of her missed the work that had once been her life. She set up the loom in the main room of the house, and as the winter progressed, she began teaching herself the art of weaving. It was challenging in ways that embroidery had not been. It required her to think in patterns and sequences, to plan the entire piece before she began rather than being able to respond to the work as it developed. But once she understood the logic of it, she found that she loved it. She wove cloth to trade to the merchants who occasionally passed through the mountains. She wove cloth for the linens they needed in the house. She wove cloth that Thomas would take to the village, and there she learned something that surprised her. The cloth she was producing, made from materials she had processed herself, worked with on the loom in the mountains, was worth more than her embroidery had ever been. The merchants bid against each other for her weaving. The village women who had once turned away from her now sought her out, wanting cloth that they could tell people had been made by the mountain man's wife. There was some irony in this, Catherine knew. The cursed woman whose handiwork had been feared was now the same woman whose handiwork was celebrated, simply because the context had changed. Nothing about the work itself was different. Nothing about Catherine's skill or her effort was different. What was different was the story that people told about it. Before, the story was that she was cursed, and therefore anything she touched would carry that curse. Now, the story was that she was fortunate, that she had escaped a dark fate and found happiness in an unlikely place, and therefore everything she touched was marked by her good fortune. Both stories, Catherine understood, were equally false. Both were equally constructed. What mattered was not the story but the work itself, and the work was good. The second spring came, and with it, visitors. A woman appeared at the house one afternoon, riding a horse carefully, as if she was not entirely confident in her ability to control it. She was older, perhaps in her 50s, with gray streaking her dark hair. Catherine recognized her immediately, though it had been years since she had seen her. It was Mrs. Eleanor Garrett, the widow of Thomas's friend from the neighboring settlement. Behind her on the horse was a young woman, a girl really, no more than 16, with Thomas's same gray eyes. Thomas emerged from the workshop, saw who was approaching, and went very still. The young woman dismounted, and Thomas looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Hello, Margaret." The girl's name was Margaret, and she was the daughter that Thomas had never told Catherine about. She had been raised by Eleanor's family after Eleanor's death, Thomas explained later that evening. There had been complications during Margaret's birth, and Eleanor had never recovered fully. Thomas's wife had survived Margaret's arrival but had lost her health, and by the time Margaret was 5 years old, Eleanor had died. The family had taken Margaret in, and Thomas had felt that the best thing he could do for the girl was to let her build a life elsewhere, away from a place that held only grief for her. But Margaret had reached an age where she wanted to know her father, and Eleanor's sister had brought her to see him. Margaret stayed for 2 weeks. Catherine watched as Thomas learned his daughter, and she saw in his face a kind of joy that she had not seen before. He showed her the house, the land, the animals. He told her stories about Eleanor, about the years they had been together, about the love he had felt for Margaret's mother. Margaret, for her part, was hungry for these stories. She asked careful questions. She listened to every answer. She looked at her father with an intensity that suggested she was trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the image of him that she had built in her mind. The night before Margaret was to leave, Catherine found Thomas outside looking at the mountains. She asked him what he was thinking about. He said he was thinking about the kind of life Margaret would have. Would she marry young? Would she have children? Would she find happiness? Or would she repeat the patterns of grief that had marked his own life? Catherine said, "You can't control that. All you can do is try to be the kind of person she can return to. The kind of person who will see her clearly and believe in her, no matter what curses the world tries to place on her." Thomas smiled at this. "You've become wise," he said. Catherine said, "I've learned from a very good teacher." When Margaret left, she hugged Catherine goodbye, which surprised them both. Margaret was a reserved girl, not given to displays of affection. But as she pulled away, she said, "Thank you for taking care of him, for making sure he was not alone." Catherine held her for an extra moment and said, "I was quite alone myself when he found me." It goes both ways. That summer and fall, Thomas and Catherine worked on expanding the house. Thomas wanted to build a larger structure, one that could accommodate Margaret whenever she might visit. They worked through the long days of autumn, Thomas and Catherine side by side, their hands growing calloused from labor, their shoulders aching from the weight of timber and stone. The village noticed. They always did. It was old Margaret who finally spoke it aloud, though others had been thinking it for months. She came to Catherine one morning in early November, ostensibly to trade preserves for wool, but her real purpose was conversation of a different kind. "You're building that house very large," Margaret said, setting her basket down on the table. She was ancient now, her back curved like a question mark, but her eyes remained sharp and bright with mischief. Catherine was stirring a pot of broth. She didn't turn around. "Thomas has ideas about the future." "Does he now?" Margaret settled herself into a chair uninvited. "And what does the future look like in Thomas's estimation?" "He wants his daughter to have a place here, a home where she belongs." The old woman was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its teasing quality. "Catherine, do you understand what you are doing?" Catherine set down her spoon. She turned to face Margaret fully. "I understand that a girl lost her mother and has a father who loves her. I understand that love is a rare enough thing in this world that when you find it, you should not look away." And the curse. There it was. The thing that had hung over Catherine for 2 years now, unspoken in polite company but ever present, like smoke that filtered into every room even when the fire was distant. "There is no curse," Catherine said quietly. Margaret's weathered face crinkled with something between pity and concern. "Child, you are the curse, or you carry it, which amounts to the same thing. Thomas has defied the will of this village by marrying you. He has brought misfortune upon himself." "Has he?" Catherine's voice grew sharp. "Tell me, Margaret, what misfortune has befallen him? His animals are healthy. His crops were plentiful. His workshop produces the finest work in 3 valleys. His hand is steady. His mind is clear. His heart is full. Where is the curse in any of this?" Margaret looked away. "These things take time. Curses are patient." "Curses are stories," Catherine interrupted. She surprised herself with the firmness of her own conviction. "They are narratives we create to explain the things we don't understand or don't like. And they are powerful not because they are real but because people choose to believe them. You chose to believe them, Margaret. The elder chose, the village chose, but Thomas did not. And look at him now." The old woman rose to her feet with difficulty, gripping the edge of the table. When she straightened, she seemed smaller somehow, diminished. "You're very sure of yourself," she said. "I'm sure of him," Catherine replied. After Margaret left, Catherine stood alone in the kitchen for a long time, her hands trembling slightly. She had spoken with such certainty, but the truth was more complicated. Yes, Thomas was happy. Yes, fortune seemed to follow him. But Catherine knew something that the village did not, something that Thomas himself might not fully understand. The curse had never been about her at all. It had been about him. About a man who had locked himself away from the world, who had built walls against grief and loss so high that nothing could reach him, not light, not warmth, not the possibility of joy. The curse was isolation. The curse was the slow death of a living man. And Catherine had not brought him fortune by marrying her. She had brought it by giving him a reason to open the door. That evening, when Thomas came home from his workshop, Catherine told him about Margaret's visit. She expected him to be troubled, but instead he simply nodded, as if this confirmed something he had long suspected. "They will always believe what they believe," he said. He was washing his hands at the basin, the water running dark with the dust of his labor. "But belief and reality are different things. I know what I have. I know what you are. That is enough." "Is it?" Catherine asked. "Is it enough for you truly? Or do you sometimes wonder if they might be right?" Thomas dried his hands and turned to her. His gray eyes were steady, serious. "I wondered once. In the beginning, I wondered if I was making a mistake, if I was risking something precious by going against the will of those around me. But I have learned something in these 2 years, Catherine. Every meaningful choice is a risk. Every act of love requires defiance of some kind, defiance of fear, of convention, of the voices that tell us we don't deserve happiness. If I had listened to them, I would still be alone. And loneliness, Catherine, is the only true curse I have ever known. He stepped closer to her and took her face in his hands. His palms were rough, warm. He kissed her forehead. I would choose you again. In every life, every version, every possible future, I would choose you. Winter came early that year, and it came hard. The snow began in October, earlier than anyone remembered, and it did not stop. Week after week, the white descended from the mountains, silent and relentless. The village was cut off from the lower passes. No traders came. No messages arrived from the outside world. It was as if they had become an island, frozen in time, forgotten by the rest of creation. The elder called a meeting in the great hall. Catherine was not invited. Women did not attend such gatherings unless their business was specifically called for. But Thomas went, as did every able-bodied man in the village. He returned after dark, his beard thick with frost, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" Catherine asked, helping him remove his coat. "What did the elder say?" "He blames you," Thomas said flatly. "The early winter, the excessive snow. He says it is a sign of the gods' displeasure. He says the curse has deepened and that only by—" He stopped. "By what?" "By expelling you from the village will the curse be lifted." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She sat down slowly on the bench by the fire. "What did you say to him?" "I told him he was a fool. I told him that curses are the language of men who cannot admit their own impotence in the face of natural events. I told him that we live in a world governed by patterns of weather and season, not by the supposed transgressions of a woman whose only crime was to accept shelter from a man who loved her. But Thomas, and then I told him that if he attempts to force you from this village, I will leave as well. Both of us. We will take what we can carry, and we will find another place to build our lives. I told him that his authority depends entirely on people who believe he has authority, and that I, for one, have stopped believing." Catherine stared at him. She had never heard Thomas speak with such vehemence, such clarity of purpose. "He will make you regret this," she whispered. "Perhaps, but I will not regret it myself." The snow continued to fall. In the village proper, food supplies grew short. The hunting became more difficult as game retreated higher into the mountains. Fuel for fires was rationed. People grew thin and quiet and afraid. But at Thomas's house, which sat slightly apart from the village, things were different. Thomas had prepared well. His storerooms were full, vegetables from the summer's harvest, meat from the autumn's hunting, grain and flour, dried fruits, preserved fish. Catherine had helped him gather and store all of it, and while she had wondered at the time why they needed so much, she understood now that Thomas had foreseen this need. He began, quietly, to share their abundance. A sack of grain here, a portion of smoked meat there. Always anonymously, always when no one was watching. Catherine would find goods left at the homes of families she knew were struggling. She never asked Thomas if he was doing it. She simply helped him prepare the offerings. One night in deep winter there came a knock on their door. When Thomas opened it, he found young Eli, the blacksmith's apprentice, shaking with cold and hunger. The boy's eyes were sunken, and he had clearly come a long way through the snow. "I'm sorry," Eli said, his words barely audible. "I shouldn't have come, but the elder has forbidden anyone to trade with your house, and my sister, she's sick and—" Thomas didn't let him finish. He pulled the boy inside, wrapped him in blankets, and gave him hot broth. Catherine brought dry clothes and sat with him while Thomas went to prepare a package of supplies. "You should not have come here," Thomas said when he returned, not unkindly. "You know what the elder will say if he discovers this." "I know," Eli said, "but my sister is more important than the elder's anger." Thomas looked at Catherine, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that the world contained more good people than the village's narratives allowed for. People who would risk punishment for compassion. People who refused to let fear dictate their choices. "Take this," Thomas said, handing Eli a large package wrapped in cloth. "Your sister will recover. The fever will break in 3 days. Give her this tea 3 times a day until then. After that, once a day for a week more, and eat this broth yourself. You are too thin." "How did you?" Eli began. "I pay attention," Thomas said simply, "and I remember what it was like to be hungry, though it was a long time ago." After Eli left, Catherine asked Thomas about it. "You were hungry once." Thomas was looking out the window at the snow, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. "Everyone is hungry once. Everyone knows what it is to want something they cannot have. The difference is what you do with that knowledge. Do you forget it? Do you hoard what you have, afraid that giving it away will diminish you? Or do you remember? Do you let it make you soft?" "You are not soft," Catherine said. "No," he agreed. "But I was, before Eleanor, before Margaret, before you. I was very soft and the world nearly broke me. It took a long time to rebuild myself as something harder, but in rebuilding, I learned something. Hardness and softness are not opposites. They are complements. A man can be strong enough to give everything and still have enough left to stand." The winter deepened. The elders' authority began to fracture as more and more villagers discovered that supplies were available to them if they were willing to seek them out. They came to Thomas's door, tentatively at first, then with increasing frequency. They came with the knowledge that to accept his help was to defy the elders' decree. But they came anyway, because survival is a more powerful motivator than obedience. Catherine watched this unfold with a kind of amazed wonder. The curse, which had been supposed to bring ruin, was instead becoming the source of salvation. The village was being divided not by Thomas's defiance, but by the elders' cruelty. And in that division, something new was being born. By the time spring came, late and reluctant, but eventually arriving, the elders' hold on the village had been substantially weakened. He had lost the respect of those he had refused to help. He had lost the fear of those he had threatened. What remained was primarily his office, and the few people loyal to him by habit or by blood relation. The day the snow finally retreated, revealing the brown earth beneath, the elder came to Thomas's house. He came alone, which was itself a remarkable thing. Catherine saw him approaching from the window and felt her heart quicken. She wanted to tell Thomas, to warn him, but Thomas had already gone out to meet the old man in the yard. She watched from inside, unable to hear their words, watching the old man's gestures grow more agitated, and then more pleading. She saw Thomas shake his head. She saw the elder reach out as if to touch Thomas's arm, and then let his hand fall. Finally, the elder turned and walked back toward the village. Thomas came inside, his face unreadable. "What did he want?" Catherine asked. "To make a bargain. He would withdraw the curse, his formal proclamation that you were cursed, if I would stop distributing supplies to the village. He said the curse was all that was keeping him in power, and if it could be dissolved, the village could return to normal." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that I had not made the curse, and therefore I could not unmake it. I told him that the curse existed only in people's hearts, and that only they could choose to stop believing in it. And I told him that I would not stop helping people in need simply to preserve his authority." Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a stone that had been sitting there for months, perhaps for years, finally rolling away. "He's finished then, the elder. His power is gone." "Perhaps," Thomas said, "but not because I destroyed it. It dissolved because people chose to see past it. That's how all power truly ends, not through force, but through the withdrawal of belief." In the weeks that followed, spring truly arrived. The snow melted. The earth began to green. And the village found itself in a strange new position. The elder remained in his office, but the office no longer meant what it once had. His pronouncements were listened to with skepticism. His judgments were questioned. And Catherine, the woman who had been cursed, became something else entirely. She was no longer the dark figure that people whispered about. She was the woman whose husband had defied convention and reaped rewards. She was proof that sometimes the curses we inherit are false, that sometimes choosing love over fear is not a risk but a salvation. But Thomas knew, and Catherine was coming to understand, that a shift in the village's opinion did not mean the story was over. It meant something new was beginning. The patterns that had held the village in place for generations were loosening, yes, but breaking patterns always creates instability, and instability creates opportunity for both growth and harm. As summer approached, the village began to fragment in ways both subtle and profound. The elder's authority had not vanished like morning mist, it had calcified into something brittle and defensive. He still occupied his stone office at the center of the village square. His seal still hung above the door, but the seal had become a relic, a monument to a power that no longer animated the hearts of those around him. Thomas noticed the first real crack on a Tuesday morning when he went to the marketplace to trade furs for grain. The vendor, a man named Aldrich who had once been among the elder's most vocal supporters, actually smiled at him. Not the careful smile of someone performing respect for a dangerous man, but a genuine expression of relief. "Your wife," Aldrich said, weighing out the grain into a leather sack. "She helped my daughter last month, when the fever came. I remember when people would have let her die rather than call for the cursed woman's touch. But my daughter was burning, Thomas. I was desperate enough to defy the elder's warnings, and Catherine came. She sat through the night. The fever broke." Aldrich paused, his weathered hand stilling on the grain. "I owe her a debt I cannot repay." Thomas accepted the grain, and in that moment he understood something crucial. The village's shift in sentiment was not going to be a gentle reconciliation. It was going to be a reckoning, because every person who had previously accepted the curse, who had lived comfortably in their fear of Catherine, now had to reckon with what they had done, what they had permitted, what they had refused to see. That evening, Thomas mentioned the conversation to Catherine as they prepared their evening meal. She was quiet for a long time, stirring the pot of stew with more deliberation than the task required. "Do you know," she said finally, "what it feels like to have people begin to see you, not as a woman, not as a person, but as a woman whose potential they had been denying?" She set down the wooden spoon. "Aldrich's relief is not about me, Thomas. It's about him. It's about him being able to admit that he chose wrongly, and surviving that admission because it turns out the world doesn't collapse when you do." Thomas moved toward her, but Catherine held up a hand. "I'm not speaking from pain, I'm speaking from observation. The curse is lifting, yes, but in its place comes something more complicated. I am becoming useful to them. And usefulness is its own kind of cage." It was a remark that would echo through the weeks that followed. As summer deepened, Catherine found herself increasingly sought out, not just for her knowledge of healing herbs, though that was part of it, but for her counsel. Women who had previously avoided her now came to her door with questions about their lives, their marriages, their futures. It was as though they had decided that if she had survived being cursed, she must understand survival in ways they did not. Thomas watched this transformation from a careful distance, observing how his wife navigated these new demands. He saw her growing weary in ways that were different from the weariness of being feared. This was the weariness of being needed. And while being needed is better than being despised, it carries its own weight. One afternoon, a young woman named Sarah came to their house. She was 17, perhaps 18, and her eyes were swollen from crying. She asked for Catherine privately, and Thomas withdrew to tend the garden, though he could hear some of what was said through the open window. "I don't know who else to ask," Sarah was saying, her voice trembling. "If anyone will understand what it's like to be trapped by what people believe about you." Catherine's voice was lower, more measured. "Tell me. The elder's grandson, he wants to marry me. My family says it's a good match, he'll be elder someday, they say, but I don't love him. I don't even like him very much. He's cruel in small ways, he mocks people. And my mother says that love doesn't matter, that a good match is about security and position. But then I see you with Thomas. I see how you look at each other. And I think, if she could refuse to be afraid, if she could choose differently, then maybe I can too. There was a long silence. Thomas, in the garden, found himself holding his breath. The path of refusal, Catherine said slowly, is not the same as the path of acceptance. If you refuse this marriage, you will face anger from your family. You will face judgment from people who believe your mother is right. You will be thought ungrateful, ambitious, stubborn. The elder's family will take it as an insult, and that insult will ripple through the village in ways both seen and unseen. Another pause. I cannot tell you what to do, but I can tell you that I have learned the difference between being cursed and being free, and freedom is much more difficult. After Sarah left, Thomas came inside to find Catherine sitting by the window, looking out toward the mountains. "What did you tell her?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The truth," Catherine said. "That the curse was survivable. That defiance is survivable, but that neither is easy, and that ease is not the goal. Truth is." The summer deepened further, and with it came an unexpected development. The elder, perhaps recognizing that his formal authority had become hollow, began to act in ways that were more covert and more dangerous. He could no longer command through pronouncement. So instead, he began to orchestrate through suggestion, and through the manipulation of the few people who remained truly loyal to him. It began with whispers, carefully placed remarks that planted seeds of doubt about Thomas's motivations. Why was he really helping the village? What did he gain from making the elder look foolish? Wasn't there something suspicious about a man who had come from outside, who had married the cursed woman, who had so quickly accumulated influence? Thomas learned of these whispers from Aldrich, who came to him one evening with an apology in his voice. "I should not have trusted him," Aldrich said. "The elder came to me and reminded me of old debts. He asked me to stop trading with you. He said that your charity was a form of manipulation, that you were building power by building obligation." "And what did you say?" Thomas asked, though his chest had tightened. "I told him that the only debt I owed was to my daughter's life, and that if he wanted me to repay that by abandoning you, then the debt was uncollectible." Aldrich's jaw was firm. "But Thomas, there are others who won't have my clarity. There are others who will listen to the elder's words and feel the old fear returning. The fear that change itself might be dangerous." Thomas thanked Aldrich and sat with this information. The elder was doing what wounded authority does. He was fighting for survival by sowing discord. And the most effective way to sow discord is to plant seeds that already exist in the soil of human nature. Fear of the outsider. Suspicion of rapid change. Doubt about motives that seem too good to be true. That night, Thomas told Catherine everything. They sat in their small house as darkness fell, and he laid out the elder's strategy with the precision of someone who understood the logic of power. "He's going to fail," Catherine said when he finished, "but not immediately, and not without causing harm." "How can you be sure he'll fail?" Thomas asked. "Because the curse failed, and the curse was more powerful than whispers. People believed in the curse because it explained their misery. It gave shape to their suffering. The elder's doubts, by contrast, only offer anxiety, and anxiety is not as adhesive as belief." She paused. "But you're right to take it seriously. Desperate men do desperate things." And indeed, the elder was growing desperate. As summer moved toward its end, his actions began to move beyond whispers into more tangible territory. He began to restrict the supplies that came through the official trade routes, routes that technically fell under his authority as elder. He suggested to several families that doing business with Thomas might be seen as an affront to tradition. And when these methods produced only limited results, he took a step that would change everything. He announced a formal inquiry into Thomas's character and intentions, to be held in the village square at the time of the summer market. When Thomas received word of this, he was not surprised. What he felt instead was a strange clarity. The elder had made a calculation, and in making that calculation, he had revealed something crucial about his own understanding of power. He believed that if he could discredit Thomas publicly, if he could make Thomas's actions seem suspect, then people would retreat back into their previous alignment. They would choose the safety of the elder's authority over the uncertain promise of Thomas's assistance. What the elder did not understand was that belief cannot simply be unmade through exposure, and Catherine understood this perhaps better than anyone. "You could leave," she said to Thomas the night before the inquiry was set to begin. "We could leave. Go to the mountains or further. We could live as we wanted to live without this." Thomas looked at his wife in the candlelight. "Could we?" he asked quietly. "Or would we simply be running toward our own version of exile?" Catherine's eyes were sad. "Probably the latter. I've already learned what exile feels like, Thomas. The external version and the internal version both. I don't know if I have the strength for it again." "Then we don't leave," Thomas said. "We stay, and we let the village see what it chooses to see." The morning of the inquiry arrived with a clarity that seemed almost too perfect. A bright, cloudless sky, the kind of day that makes everything visible, that offers no shadows to hide in. The village square filled with people by late morning. The elder had made sure that this would be a public spectacle. He had nothing left but theater, and he was going to make it grand. Thomas walked into the square with Catherine at his side, a choice that was itself a statement. In another world, in another time, it might have seemed foolish, the accused appearing alongside the cursed woman. But Thomas understood that symbology was precisely the point. He wanted the village to see them together. He wanted them to see that he did not believe in the curse, that he did not believe in the whispers, that he stood beside his wife not out of obligation but out of choice. The elder sat in a high chair that had been erected for the occasion. He looked older than he had even a few weeks before, as though the loss of his authority had accelerated the aging of his body. But his voice, when he spoke, still carried authority. He had power over the ritual, at least. He had power over the words that would be spoken. "Thomas of the Mountain," the elder began, his voice carrying across the square, "you have come to our village as an outsider. You have presented yourself as a man of goodwill and assistance. And yet, questions have been raised about your true motivations. Questions about whether your charity is genuine, or whether it is a form of manipulation designed to accumulate power and influence in our community." Thomas stood still, his hands at his sides. He said nothing. The elder continued, "These are serious matters, and so I have brought you here to answer them publicly, to defend yourself before your peers, to tell us, in your own words, why a man from outside our village would come here and do what you have done without any apparent desire for compensation or reward." Now the elder fell silent and all eyes turned toward Thomas. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility. Thomas could see people's faces, some curious, some skeptical, some still holding the old fear like a weapon ready to be drawn. Thomas spoke, and when he did, his voice was quiet enough that people had to lean forward to hear. "I came to this village because I heard of a place where fear had become the primary law. I came because I am a man who has seen many villages, many communities, and I am always troubled by what I find. The ways we blame our suffering on others, the ways we create enemies from among ourselves to avoid looking at our own complicity." He paused, letting his gaze move slowly across the gathered crowd. "I married Catherine because she was kind, because she was brave, and because I loved her. Everything I have done since then, every supply I have distributed, every person I have helped, I have done not because I seek power, but because I believe that people deserve better than fear." "Convenient words," the elder said sharply. "But words are easy. Actions are what matter, and your actions have had the effect of diminishing my authority and my ability to maintain order in this village." "Your authority was maintained through fear," Thomas said, his voice still level. "I have not diminished it. The village has, because they recognize that fear is not a good foundation for community." The elder's face flushed with anger. "And in its place, you would have chaos. You would have every person doing as they please, following their own desires without regard for order or tradition. No, Thomas said, I would have people making choices. Real choices, based on their own judgment rather than on fear of punishment or curse. I would have a community that functions not because people are afraid to do otherwise, but because they believe in the functioning of that community. It was a subtle point, but Thomas could see it landing in some faces. He could see people considering it, turning it over in their minds like a stone found on the riverbed, unfamiliar but not without beauty. But the elder was not finished. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with something that might have been desperation, or might have been cruelty, or might have been both simultaneously. You speak of belief and choice, but what you have done is force people into a new belief. You have forced them to believe that the curse was false. You have forced them to reconsider what they thought they knew. And now you have the nerve to speak, as though you are merely offering options. Thomas felt something shift in his understanding. The elder had articulated something true, even if he meant it as an accusation. Thomas had indeed been instrumental in changing the village's beliefs. The question was whether that change was something to be ashamed of. He was about to respond when Catherine stepped forward. She moved into the center of the square, and the crowd parted for her as though by instinct. She approached the elder's chair and looked up at him, her face calm and composed. I was cursed, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. By you, you made a pronouncement and you meant it. You meant for me to be isolated and feared. You meant for that fear to consolidate your power, and it worked for a time. She paused. But curses are only as powerful as the people who believe in them. I did not stop being cursed because Thomas convinced everyone to disbelieve you. I stopped being cursed the moment I decided that your words had no power over my life. The elder's face had gone pale. Catherine continued, what Thomas has done is not force belief. What he has done is shown people an alternative. He has shown them that choice exists. And now they must live with the consequences of knowing that choice exists. There is no going back from that knowledge. She turned and walked back to stand beside Thomas. And in that moment, the dynamic of the entire inquiry shifted. The elder had called for a trial, expecting to reassert his authority. Instead, he had created a platform for his own exposure. And worse, from his perspective, he had created that platform in front of the entire village. The elder rose from his chair, his voice suddenly sharp and angry. This inquiry is concluded, he declared. And it proves what I have long suspected, that the two of you are a corruption in this village, that your presence here is a contamination that must be addressed. He turned to the few men who still supported him, those who had come to the square with a kind of grim loyalty. Let it be known that I am withdrawing the curse's dissolution. Let it be known that Catherine, daughter of the mountain people, is cursed once again. And let it be known that any person who continues to associate with her or with this outsider does so at their own risk, under my judgment. The pronouncement hung in the air, and for a moment, just a moment, Thomas felt doubt. He felt the old power of the elder's words, the old weight of pronouncement and authority. He wondered if he had miscalculated, if he had underestimated the enduring power of formal structures and ancient fear. But then he heard a voice from the crowd. It was Aldrich's daughter, the young woman whose fever Catherine had tended. She was perhaps 15 years old, and she stood up and called out, My mother died of fever when I was small because no one would help her. Everyone was too afraid of the curse. The elder let her die rather than risk his authority. I am not afraid anymore. And then another voice joined, a woman whose child Catherine had delivered safely, a man whose wound Catherine had tended, a family whose hunger Catherine had helped ease. One by one, people stood up and spoke. Not dramatically, not as though performing for the crowd, but simply as people who had lived through the experience of Catherine's kindness and had chosen to acknowledge it. The elder watched this unfold from his high chair, and Thomas saw something break in his face. Not visibly, not in any way that would be obvious to a casual observer, but spiritually. The old man seemed to collapse inward, to diminish, to become less present in the world even as his body continued to occupy space. The inquiry had become a reckoning that the elder had not anticipated and could not control. And in that uncontrolled reckoning lay the seeds of something that had not existed before, the actual possibility of change. Not imposed change, not forced change, but change that had grown organically from the choices of individuals. But as the crowd began to disperse, and the afternoon light slanted golden across the village square, Thomas felt no triumph. What he felt instead was a deep weariness and a profound uncertainty. The elder's authority was truly broken now. The curse was exposed as something that had existed primarily in the minds of people who had chosen to believe in it. The village had glimpsed the possibility of something different. And yet, Thomas understood that Catherine had been correct when she said that breaking patterns creates instability. The village was entering a new phase, one that could not yet be clearly seen or understood. The old rules no longer held complete power, but new rules had not yet solidified. And in that space between the death of one order and the birth of another, anything could happen. That evening, as Thomas and Catherine sat on the porch of their house, watching the sun descend toward the mountains, a messenger came from the village. It was a young man named Peter, who had always treated Thomas with basic courtesy, but with none of the warmth that had developed in some others. "The elder wishes to speak with you," Peter said, addressing Thomas directly. "He has asked me to extend an invitation for you to come to his office at first light." Thomas and Catherine exchanged a glance. "What does he want?" Thomas asked. Peter shrugged. "He didn't say. He only said that what he has to discuss is too important for the village square. It is a private matter." After Peter left, Catherine moved closer to Thomas. "It could be a trap," she said quietly. "It could be many things," Thomas agreed. "But if I refuse to meet with him, it will only feed the narrative that I am afraid of him, that I am unwilling to face him directly. And if you go, you might walk into something dangerous." Thomas considered this. The elder was, at his core, a man who had lost everything that had defined him. Such men could be either harmless or extremely dangerous. There was little middle ground. "I'll go," Thomas said finally. "But you should know where I am. If I'm not back by mid-morning, you should send for Aldrich." Catherine nodded, but her face remained worried. She did not argue further, which was itself significant.